In the grand halls of the Habsburg Empire, history remembers Maria Theresa as a warrior queen, a ruler who defied kings, reshaped Europe, and birthed a dynasty that would dominate a continent. But behind the gold, behind the ceremonies and treaties, there existed a secret so painful it never entered official record. Hidden miscarriages, infants who never lived long enough to be named. Mothers do not leave chronicles, empires do. And in the shadows of Vienna's palace, one empress carried a sorrow far darker than any war she ever fought. In 1740, when Maria Theresa ascended the throne of the sprawling Habsburg Empire, Europe saw only a young woman stepping into a role built for men. But the weight placed upon her shoulders was not merely political. Even as dignitaries bowed and her coronation robe settled upon the marble floors of Vienna, she felt the familiar heaviness in her abdomen, the early signs of yet another pregnancy. The court whispered that she was already risking the stability of the realm by daring to rule while her body was occupied with maternal burdens. To them, an empress could lead armies only if she could first prove she could produce heirs. Her doctors examined her with methods that carried more superstition than science. They measured her pulse by holding her wrist until her skin reddened, pressed iron tools against her stomach to test firmness, and whispered among themselves about the signs of a boy or a girl. Behind every ritual was fear. Fear that her womb would betray the crown before her reign even began. Europe waited eagerly for her to fail. Old allies doubted her legitimacy. Rival rulers dismissed her as a temporary inconvenience. Every month of uncertainty became ammunition for foreign courts. During state audiences, she felt diplomats' eyes drift to her waistline. She heard rumors traveling through embassies that she was too frail, that her pregnancies made her unfit to command, that Austria was foolish to place an empire in the hands of a woman whose body was already battling itself. Still, she smiled, bowed her head with imperial dignity, and held her breath against the pain. The palace midwives were gentler than the physicians, but they too carried their own burdens of expectation. They advised quiet rest, herbal infusions, and strict silence regarding her condition. The empire must never appear weak. Maria Theresa, barely past the age of 20, learned to balance the conflicting demands of war councils and maternity. She reviewed military reports while fighting waves of nausea. She drafted decrees while gripping the arm of a chair to steady herself. The throne had no patience for her trembling hands. Then, one evening in the private apartments of Habsburg Palace, she felt a sharp, unmistakable pain that drove the air from her lungs. No witnesses were present, only a single lady-in-waiting who recognized the pale terror crossing the Empress's face. A physician was summoned quietly, the kind of summons that left no trace in official records. The verdict was delivered with cold efficiency. The pregnancy had ended before it could truly begin. By dawn, the news was already buried beneath layers of protocol. Servants disposed of the small remains with practiced discretion. She rose from her bed, pale but composed, and stepped into a room full of ministers who would never know what she had lost during the night. Her crown was placed upon her head, her robes fastened with jewels. She carried out her duties with the serene authority expected of her. But behind every signature she placed that morning lay the silent grief of a child who would never be counted among the Habsburg heirs. It was the first of many losses she would endure, and the first that the empire insisted she hide. When the War of the Austrian Succession ignited across Europe, Maria Theresa found herself ruling not from a throne, but from sickbeds, council chambers, and prayer stools. The empire demanded firmness, but her body remained caught between statesmanship and the fragile arithmetic of pregnancy. She had conceived again, though only her closest attendants knew. Ministers believed she was merely indisposed, unaware of how often she pressed a handkerchief to her lips to hide trembling breaths. The war reshaped her daily existence. Every messenger brought news of betrayal or invasion. Prussia marched confidently into Silesia, exploiting what they saw as a moment of female weakness. Maria Theresa read the reports while sitting rigidly, aware that stress could threaten her unborn child. Yet she could not show hesitation. Any sign of fragility would encourage her enemies further. So she forced her voice steady, even as waves of sharp pain echoed through her abdomen. Physicians, summoned in secrecy, insisted on treatments they believed essential for preserving the pregnancy. They prescribed long hours of bed rest, punctuated by vigorous stimulation of circulation. They applied heated cloths, tightened supportive bindings around her waist, and demanded that she consume bitter tonics meant to fortify maternal strength. The Empress complied with a stoicism that unsettled even her attendants. She had learned to suffer quietly. It was the only form of disobedience her circumstances allowed. Among the doctors was doctors. Knapp, a stern, gray-bearded man revered by the court but mistrusted by the midwives. He believed in harsh regimens, treating a royal pregnancy as a battlefield where discipline would triumph over nature. He spoke openly of the necessity of producing a male heir, as if her body were a forge to be guided rather than a living, vulnerable vessel. His fingers pressed too hard during examinations. His gaze lingered with judgment rather than care. Maria Theresa endured him because tradition demanded it, though she preferred the steady presence of her midwives, who whispered prayers and touched her with gentleness. One morning, while reviewing a letter from her ambassador in London, she felt a sudden warmth across her thigh, a sensation she recognized instantly. She excused the counsel with a calmness that masked her rising terror. In her private rooms, she found that the bleeding had already begun. The midwife knelt beside her, whispering reassurances, but the Empress saw in her eyes the quiet confirmation of another inevitable loss. Maria Theresa remained seated in silence as the pain deepened, allowing the miscarriage to take its course. She neither cried out nor reached for assistance. The midwife held her hand, but the Empress looked past her, staring at the painted ceiling as if searching for a reason heaven had refused to give her. When the small remains were taken away to be wrapped in linen and hidden from political sight, Maria Theresa thanked the servants with a composure that defied the fragility of her condition. That evening, she appeared before her ministers, her face pale yet unyielding. Not one of them noticed the trembling beneath her sleeves. They presented military maps, argued strategies, and debated alliances, believing they were witnessing an empress strengthened by adversity. But Maria Theresa understood the truth with painful clarity. The empire cared more for the child she failed to bear than for the woman who had carried it. It was the moment she realized that her humanity had become expendable. In the early years of Maria Theresa's reign, the struggle for authority did not unfold only in war rooms or royal courts. A quieter, more intimate conflict took place within the palace walls, a conflict over her body itself. The male physicians, endorsed by ministers who believed only men understood the science of birth, tried to claim dominion over her pregnancies. Yet the midwives, armed with generations of practical knowledge, resisted their intrusion. Caught between these two factions, the Empress became both patient and battleground. The physicians demanded formal reports on her condition, written in the impersonal language of medical superiority. They treated her pregnancy as a matter of state, an extension of imperial strategy. They dismissed the midwives as creatures of superstition, accusing them of endangering royal heirs with outdated practices. But the midwives understood her fear, her exhaustion, and the unspoken truth that Maria Theresa trusted their hands more than any surgeon's instruments. Still, the court insisted on involving the physicians in every detail. They ordered daily examinations regardless of how the Empress felt. Their evaluations were often delivered in the presence of ministers, transforming her most private struggle into a political spectacle. Every opinion was contested. Should she rest? Should she walk? Should she eat more? Should she fast? Ministers debated these questions with the same intensity they applied to matters of war. For them, her womb was the empire's most precarious frontier. As pressure mounted, Maria Theresa learned to navigate this internal battlefield with the same precision required on actual battle maps. She listened to the physician's instructions, but quietly followed the midwife's advice when she could. She hid her pain with practiced discipline, aware that any expression of weakness would be interpreted as incompetence, not as a woman suffering, but as an empress failing. During a diplomatic gathering held to negotiate support from smaller German states, Maria Theresa felt a familiar, unsettling heaviness within her. She had suspected for days that she might be pregnant again, though she had dared tell no one, not even her husband. Too many pregnancies had ended before they could be spoken aloud. She feared that acknowledging hope would invite disappointment. The hall was filled with ministers, ambassadors, and military officers. Gold chandeliers cast flickering light over the polished floors, while courtiers whispered about troop movements and alliances. Maria Theresa stood rigidly, her back straight, her dignity intact, as an envoy from Saxony presented her with a ceremonial document. She accepted it with a steady hand, until a sudden sharp pain seized her lower abdomen. The sensation was unmistakable. It cut through her like a thin blade, precise and merciless. Her vision wavered, but her expression did not. Her attendant stepped slightly closer, sensing the change in her breathing. She shifted her weight and found the warm, sinking feeling she dreaded. Without breaking composure, she handed the document to a minister and offered a faint, controlled smile. The midwife stood behind her, disguised as a lady-in-waiting. When she glanced down and saw the small but growing stain on the Empress's gown, her face drained of color. Yet neither woman spoke. The diplomatic negotiations continued without pause. Courtiers maintained their masks of civility, pretending not to see the quiet disaster unfolding in front of them. Maria Theresa excused herself only when etiquette could justify it. She retreated from the hall with the grace expected of a monarch, even as life slipped from within her. Once she reached her private chamber, the miscarriage became undeniable. The midwife moved swiftly, her hands practiced in trembling. When it was over, Maria Theresa sat in silence. No tears, no outcry. Only a hollow stillness. And beyond the chamber doors, the empire continued, indifferent, as always, to the cost. Within the sprawling Habsburg palace, far from the gilded halls where ministers debated treaties and officers laid out war strategies, there existed a smaller, quieter chamber reserved only for the Empress. Officially, it was described in palace records as a resting apartment, a modest room meant for convalescence during times of illness. But among the servants who tended to Maria Theresa, it carried another name whispered only behind closed doors: the linen room. It was here, not the grand birthing chambers, where the earliest tragedies of her motherhood unfolded. The room held none of the splendor associated with royalty. Its walls were pale, its furnishings sparse: a narrow bed, a washing basin, a wooden chest lined with folded linens. To outsiders, it appeared unremarkable. To Maria Theresa, it became a place where she confronted the intimate consequences of duty, repeatedly and in silence. Every time she suspected that a pregnancy might be failing, she asked to be brought there. It was a sanctuary only in the sense that no courtier would dare intrude. Servants entrusted with tending to her during these moments were carefully selected. They were older women who had served the Habsburg family for decades, women whose loyalty had been tested through countless royal secrets. Their instructions were simple and absolute. Whatever happened in that room was never to be spoken beyond its threshold. They moved with quiet efficiency, preparing cloths, boiling water, and keeping vigil as the Empress faced yet another crisis alone. In one particularly somber episode, Maria Theresa lay half upright on the modest bed, her face pale beneath the dim candlelight. The pain had returned, a slow, inevitable rhythm that signaled the loss she feared. Her attendants remained at her side, their hands steady, their eyes downcast. When it was over, one of the women reached into the wooden chest, retrieving a square of soft linen used for only one purpose. She wrapped the tiny, undeveloped form with the tenderness of someone preparing a child for baptism, even though this one would never receive a name. Maria Theresa watched in silence. She did not reach out, nor did she ask to hold what little remained. She had learned from past anguish that her grief would not alter the responsibilities waiting for her beyond that room. But she acknowledged the life lost with a whispered prayer, spoken so softly that even the attendants bent closer to hear. The ritual, though simple, carried profound weight for her, a fragile thread of humanity preserved within the machinery of empire. Once the remains were secured in linen, 2 servants departed through a side passage designed for discreet movement. Their task was to deliver the shrouded bundle to another chamber where burial decisions would be made away from the public eye. The palace would not record the event. The ministers would not be informed. The court would remain unaware. By the next morning, the linen room would be cleaned, the bed remade, and life within the Habsburg would continue as though nothing had occurred. For Maria Theresa, these silent episodes wove themselves into a private history that no historian could fully uncover. She began to realize that her personal tragedies were not accidents of nature, but casualties of an empire that demanded constant strength. Her body had become part of the political apparatus, its successes celebrated, its failures concealed beneath carefully folded linens. Each loss seemed less her own and more another event absorbed into the mechanisms of state. As she left the chamber after yet another sorrow, she touched the doorframe gently, a gesture not of farewell, but of resigned recognition. The empire had taken many things from her already. But in that quiet room, it had taken something far deeper, the right to grieve as simply a mother. The court measured time in births. Every year without a healthy infant was whispered about in foreign embassies as if it were a military failure. Maria Theresa learned this early, in an empire built on alliances, treaties, and fragile loyalties. A queen's womb was not a private chamber of hope, but a public battlefield. After the loss of yet another child, so small that even the midwives hesitated to use the word infant, the palace was soaked in a brittle quiet. Servants walked softly. Dignitaries kept their faces neutral, but Vienna hummed beneath her feet with rumors, each one sharper than the last. She pretended not to hear them, though her ladies repeated them in whispers they believed she could not catch. At the Prussian embassy, one diplomat muttered that Austria weakens from the womb outward. Another wrote to Paris that the Habsburg succession was as thin as a dying branch. These words traveled like invisible arrows, and though they never struck her body, they pierced something deeper. Her sense of worth, her sense of destiny, the fragile confidence of a woman who had been raised to rule, but not prepared for this particular grief. Her surviving children, lively as they were, only magnified the absence of the ones who never made it past the cradle. When she watched her toddlers take their first steps, she saw the shadows of those who never even lived long enough to be baptized. In the nursery, embroidered blankets lay neatly folded in a chest gift sent by foreign rulers in anticipation of births that never came to pass. She could not bring herself to throw them away. Instead, she touched them gently on lonely evenings, as if the fabric still held the warmth of a life that never began. She wrote letters during those nights, letters that history preserves only in fragments, though the depth of her private sorrow survives between the lines. She confessed to her sister that she felt as if Providence had set her on a throne only to test how much a mother could lose before she shattered. She apologized for failing to give the empire another healthy child, though no one had asked for such an apology. Her words were heavy with guilt, but guilt she never deserved. "Perhaps," she wrote in one letter, "God has taken my children to remind me that crowns are not given without a cost." The court physicians tried to speak in soft tones. They blamed exhaustion, stress, divine will, anything that might soften the truth. But Maria Theresa blamed herself. Not in reason, but in emotion. A woman of immense strength can still break from within, and she felt that breaking in the quiet moments after midnight, when music from palace celebrations drifted faintly through the corridors, mocking the emptiness she carried. One afternoon, while walking through the gallery of state portraits, she paused before the paintings of her ancestors, faces stern with authority, eyes fixed on eternity. How many of them, she wondered, had buried their hopes in silence? How many queens had smiled at ceremonies while their hearts still ached from fresh loss? The portraits, though lifeless, answered her with their stillness. In frustration, she pressed her forehead against the cold marble wall behind her. "Let me have one child who stays," she whispered, "not for succession, not for treaties, but for herself." That night, she did not pray for victory in war or dominion over Europe. She prayed, simply and desperately, for a baby who would live. The empire wanted an heir. Maria Theresa wanted a heartbeat. The night was meant to symbolize stability. An elaborate diplomatic celebration hosted in Vienna's grandest embassy hall, where chandeliers shimmered like frozen constellations and carpets imported from Persia swallowed every footstep in luxurious silence. Maria Theresa moved among the guests with a queen's trained grace, though her body felt strangely heavy, as if winter itself had settled inside her bones. She smiled, nodded, and endured compliments that meant little. Diplomacy demanded performance, even when the heart was tired. The ambassadors watched her closely. Every gesture became a line in their private reports. Her health, her posture, even the firmness of her voice factored into calculations about Austria's future. Maria Theresa knew this, which was why she forced herself to rise from the throne that night, despite a deep ache twisting low in her abdomen. It happened in a single, terrible moment. A warmth spread through her body, a warmth she recognized instantly because she had felt it before. The unmistakable sign. The quiet ending of another life before it had even begun. She froze. Her fingers tightened on the armrest of the throne. The hall around her dimmed, not from the candles, but from shock. She did not gasp, did not tremble. A queen could not afford to, but beneath her gown, pain unfurled like a blade. A maid trained for such emergencies, sworn to secrecy, caught the flicker of distress in her eyes. She knelt behind the Empress with practiced speed, adjusting the folds of Maria Theresa's heavy silk skirts. The girl's hands trembled as she tried to hide the sudden, spreading stain that seeped onto the pale threads of the embassy rug. The court musicians noticed the shift in atmosphere. Without a signal, they began to play louder violins, rising sharply to conceal any sound that might betray what was happening. The melody turned frantic, desperate, a sound that clashed with the controlled elegance of the room. Guests glanced at one another, confused but unwilling to ask questions. Maria Theresa stood. Somehow, impossibly, she stood. Her spine was rigid, her chin held high, but her face had drained of color. The warmth between her legs grew heavier, and each step felt like she was walking through water. Still, she moved forward, as if the entire empire were balanced upon her ability to walk out of that hall without collapsing. She managed 3 steps. She managed 4. By the 5th, the room tilted. A diplomat from Saxony rushed forward, startled by her sudden sway, but she lifted a hand to stop him. Touch would break her composure, she knew that. With what strength remained, she forced herself toward the side door, her vision blurring. The maid followed close behind, gathering the trailing fabric of the Empress's dress so no one would see the deep red blooming across it. The moment the door closed behind her, Maria Theresa's body gave way. She sank to the floor, breath sharp and shallow, one hand pressed against her abdomen as if she could hold the loss inside by sheer will. A physician arrived within seconds, but his expression told her what she already knew. There was nothing left to save. "Not again," she whispered, her voice cracking on the edge of despair. Not like this. Her attendants bowed their heads. They had witnessed grief before, but never grief so silent, so forced, so unbearably regal. On the embassy rugs, behind the sealed doors, the blood dried quickly. But in Maria Theresa, the wound stayed open. The winter after the embassy incident settled over Vienna with an unforgiving stillness. Snow blanketed the courtyards of the Habsburg palace, muting the sound of carriage wheels and softening the outlines of statues that had witnessed centuries of triumph and sorrow. Inside her private apartments, Maria Theresa found herself withdrawing from the rituals of court life. Her attendants assumed she needed rest. Her ministers believed she required time to restore her public composure. None of them suspected what she was truly doing behind the locked doors of her study. On the smallest desk in the palace, an unassuming walnut table tucked behind a heavy tapestry lay sheets of parchment that no historian would ever catalogue. They were not addressed to ministers, generals, or sovereigns. They bore no seals, no diplomatic codes, no traces of statecraft. Each one began with a line she wrote slowly, painfully, again and again, to my child, whom I could not keep. She wrote them at night, when the palace slept, when the corridors ceased echoing with political demands. She lit only one candle, as if afraid that too much light would expose her grief. The letters themselves were not confessions, they were attempts to make sense of the emptiness she carried. She spoke to the children she never named, explaining the world they would never see. Its wars, alliances, courtly expectations, and the peculiar burden of being born into a body that was both revered and exploited by empires. She wrote of the first quickening she felt with each pregnancy, how those brief fluttering moments filled her with an indescribable hope. She described the quiet dread that followed each loss, the dark stains concealed by linen, the hurried footsteps of servants sworn to secrecy, the faint scent of iron that always lingered after the physicians left. She wrote of the way the monarchy processed her grief, efficient, discreet, unspoken. Each miscarriage was treated not as the death of a child, but as the disruption of a political strategy. In one letter, she admitted something she never dared speak aloud. "You were not only my child, you were a demand placed upon me by nations that measured a mother's worth by the heirs she delivered." Her hand trembled as she wrote it, for she knew it to be true. Every ambassador, every minister, every foreign monarch had an opinion on her womb. It was the one political battlefield where she was expected to win without faltering. The letters carried no bitterness, only a sorrow so deep it seemed carved into the parchment. She apologized to the unborn children for living in a world where their existence meant advantage or loss, alliance or vulnerability. She told them she wished she could have shielded them from such cold arithmetic. One night, after writing for hours, she gathered the letters and hid them in a wooden chest lined with linen. She placed it beneath her prayer stool, a place even the closest attendants rarely disturbed. She touched the lid gently, as if placing a hand on the shoulder of someone she loved. For a moment, she closed her eyes. The palace felt unbearably large, its silence heavier than any crown she wore. It was then she understood. Her unborn children were the quiet casualties of European power struggles, not spoken of, not mourned publicly, not recorded, but lost. Lost in ways that shaped her more profoundly than any treaty or war. And so she continued to write, because it was the only burial she could give them. The dawn that followed her secret writings brought no relief. The empire, indifferent to her sleeplessness, moved with its usual voracious appetite. Treaties awaited signatures. Generals requested orders. Advisors circled her like hawks, concealing their ambition beneath the polished veneer of loyalty. They believed the Empress to be unshakable, a woman whose will alone held Austria together during wars that threatened its very existence. Few realized how frail she had become, and none dared acknowledge it aloud. Maria Theresa entered the council chamber with steady steps, though her body betrayed her. Beneath the embroidered silk of her gown, she felt a dull ache, an ache she had known before, an ache she feared. The familiar cramping, the lightheadedness, the tightening breath. She had not told anyone she suspected she was pregnant again. She dared not speak the possibility, for she already knew the answer the empire expected: another child, another hope for stability. As the ministers unfurled maps across the table, debating the future of borderlands, she pressed her palm against the chair's wooden edge, grounding herself. Their voices blurred, layered like a distant storm. Every sentence, every demand felt like a weight placed directly on her chest. They spoke of alliances that required more heirs, of marriages they intended to negotiate for her surviving children, of political threats that could be softened by the birth of another infant. Her womb had become a treaty table. She forced her breathing to remain even, but the pain sharpened suddenly, like a blade drawn across tender flesh. She excused herself briefly, enough to step behind a curtain where the world blurred around her. She rested her forehead against the cold stone wall, willing herself not to collapse. She recognized the unmistakable sensation, the silent unraveling of yet another life. Not here, not now. Not again. A maid who had once served in the secret linen room spotted her from afar and hurried to her side, carrying a folded cloth already prepared for such hidden emergencies. No words were exchanged. The monarchy had created a silent language for its darkest moments. Maria Theresa returned to the council table moments later, pale but composed. No one asked why her hands trembled. No one dared. The meeting resumed as if nothing had happened, as if the Empress were not losing a child at that very moment while debating taxation and military expenditures. She sat through the entire discussion, her vision wavering at the edges. Every heartbeat felt like a countdown. Yet she remained seated, regal, unbroken. Because this was what the empire demanded, constancy, even as her body betrayed her. By the time the ministers finally rose from their chairs, bowing deeply before leaving the room, she felt the last flicker of life inside her extinguish. Her abdomen tightened with a hollowing emptiness she recognized too well. When the chamber finally emptied, she released the breath she had been holding. The maid from earlier returned, wordless, helping her walk to her private apartments. She left faint marks along the way, small, nearly invisible reminders of the invisible grief she carried. Inside her room, she collapsed onto the bed. Sweat beaded her forehead. A cold shiver ran through her body. She felt feverish, drained, consumed by the familiar mixture of sorrow and duty. She whispered to herself, "How many more must the empire take?" But she already knew the answer. Empires take everything, and they never apologize. Long after the ceremonies of court had ended, and Vienna slept beneath the quiet glow of lanterns, Maria Theresa would slip through corridors few dared enter. The Habsburg palace, grand and unyielding by day, transformed at night into a labyrinth of shadows. It was in these hours that she visited the hidden corners of her domain. Corners no historian recorded, corners where her smallest, most private losses were laid to rest. The imperial nursery held beds draped with silks, but these were for the children who survived infancy. For the unborn, those who never drew breath, there were no grand ceremonies, no angelic inscriptions, no heralded burials. Instead, the palace contained discreet alcoves, small niches beneath stone staircases, and narrow chambers far from the main halls. The servants who tended these resting places had done so in silence for decades, ensuring the empire's image remained flawless. Maria Theresa moved with soft, measured steps, her skirts whispering against the polished floors. She carried a candle, its flame trembling, revealing just enough to guide her along. Each step brought her closer to the alcove where a modest stone marked the final resting place of children she had never named. There were no dates, no titles, only blank markers that acknowledged existence without ceremony. She knelt before the first, her gloved hands resting lightly on the cold stone, feeling a heartbeat that belonged not to her own body, but to memory. She whispered names she had never had the courage to speak aloud before. Sometimes she gave them familiar titles she had imagined. Sometimes she simply murmured, "My little one," repeating it for each stone until the room seemed filled with ghosts of hope, shadows of the life that might have been. The air was cold, carrying the faint scent of aged stone and candle wax, a scent that mingled with her grief. In the quiet, she could almost hear the palace breathing around her, the rustle of tapestries, the distant echo of guards' boots on marble, the sigh of history folding over itself. It was as if the walls themselves recognized her sorrow, offering no judgment, no consolation, only their own silent endurance. She thought of the children she had lost in the linen room, wrapped in soft cloth and taken away in secrecy. The unmarked graves were their only memory beyond her own recollection, a private monument to lives that had never touched the surface of official history. Each visit was a pilgrimage, a ritual she performed alone, knowing that no one could understand the depth of what she felt. Her hand traced the stone of another small grave, and she whispered the political realities that had stolen these children from her: wars, alliances, treaties, all of which had placed the crown above maternal grief. The empire had thrived, boundaries had been drawn, victories had been won, but for her, every gain had been paid in private funerals and silent tears. She rose slowly, candlelight catching her weary eyes. For a moment, she imagined the children gathering around her, invisible yet present, small souls waiting for the peace she could not fully grant them in life. She placed the candle carefully beside the last grave and let her shadow fall over the stones one final time. When she returned to her chambers, the corridors were as silent as before, yet Maria Theresa carried the weight of unspoken history with her. The empire slept, secure in its power. She, however, carried the ghosts, the unseen, unrecorded, unacknowledged graves that would follow her to the end of her days. Because power demanded heirs, but humanity demanded remembrance. The winter storm arrived with merciless precision, gusting through Vienna like an omen of what was to come. Snow lashed the palace windows, wind rattled the shutters, and the world outside seemed as unforgiving as the court that demanded her continued strength. Inside, Maria Theresa felt the familiar and terrifying weight in her body, the warning signs she had come to dread. She had long suspected that her final pregnancy carried the same fate as the ones before, yet she had dared to hope, quietly, desperately, that this child might survive. Physicians, summoned immediately, scrutinized her with clipped detachment. Their faces were grave, but their words were carefully measured to sound factual, not emotional. The age of the Empress, combined with the stress of state matters, may have contributed, one said, his tone steady but void of comfort. Ministers, summoned for reports, avoided any implication of negligence. Instead, they offered analyses and projections as if her womb had been another department of governance. No one spoke of loss in human terms. Maria Theresa, however, required no translation. She felt the life within her cease, the warmth of possibility vanish, leaving only an emptiness that no crown, no ceremony, no diplomatic triumph could fill. The child she carried was gone, unmarked by the chronicles of the empire, unremembered by those whose existence had demanded it. A funeral would be private, unrecorded, the final act of a long series of tragedies hidden beneath the machinery of state. She knew that historians, decades or centuries hence, would see only her reign's victories, treaties won, borders secured, armies commanded. They would not see the cost paid in silent grief, in cradles that remained empty, in lives that never touched the world outside the palace. The Empress felt the cold seep into her bones, not from the storm outside, but from the profound solitude inside. She held her hands together and allowed herself a rare, shuddering cry, though she quickly stifled it. There was no one to mourn with, no one permitted to witness her fracture. Her attendants, loyal and composed, followed the protocols they had been trained in. They cleaned, they prepared linens, they wrapped her loss with the same care as countless previous tragedies. But nothing could restore what was gone. As the night deepened, she lay upon her bed, candlelight flickering over the cold marble floors. The sound of wind through the palace corridors seemed to echo the hollow ache within her. She thought of every private funeral she had endured, every letter never sent, every whispered name never spoken aloud. The empire had required her to endure these losses silently, to perform her duties with a calm exterior, while her heart was hollowed by grief. She reflected on the irony. Every conquest, every alliance, every political gain had been secured through her own suffering. Every treaty had been signed with a hidden tally of private funerals. She had paid a personal price in full, yet the world would never acknowledge it. Her body, her heart, her capacity to love had been harnessed for the empire, and each miscarriage was a cruel, intimate testament to that reality. By the first light of morning, the storm had passed. Snow coated the palace grounds like a pure, unyielding shroud. Maria Theresa rose, her face pale but composed, her steps deliberate. She knew the empire expected nothing less than a functioning sovereign. She had lost the last child she would carry, yet the throne demanded she remain entire. The Empress carried the weight of centuries on her shoulders, and the loss in her heart remained unseen. The years had left Maria Theresa weathered, her hands marked by the relentless weight of governance, her face etched with lines that spoke more of quiet sorrow than age. Vienna, once a stage of youthful hope and ambition, had grown familiar with her steady, commanding presence. The empire had flourished under her guidance, borders secured, armies disciplined, alliances forged and maintained. Yet, in the solitude of her private chambers, she carried the memories no treaties could measure, the children the empire never recognized, the losses never recorded in history. She sat by a small window overlooking the palace grounds, the winter light pale and unforgiving. In her hands lay a collection of letters she had written over decades, letters never sent, addressed to the children she had carried but never held. Each sheet bore her hand, her sorrow, her longing. Each line traced a heartbeat she had lost, a life erased before it had touched the world. Reading them again, she felt the familiar ache, a hollow that power and prestige could never fill. A confessor, long trusted, knelt in the corner, observing her with quiet attentiveness. She confessed, not of sin in the religious sense, but of grief too heavy to carry alone. "Father," she whispered, her voice trembling, "my greatest suffering has not been war or rebellion. It has been the silent little souls I have lost in the shadows of this empire. No historian will ever know them. No court will remember their absence. And yet, I have borne them all alone." He said nothing, only allowed the words to settle in the room, as if recognizing that no consolation could reach the depth of a mother's unrecorded grief. Outside, the sounds of the palace persisted, distant footsteps, the faint clatter of carriages, the rustle of courtiers attending to affairs that had no bearing on her personal anguish. Within, she was both sovereign and mourner, ruler and bereaved mother, a woman whose power was inseparable from the losses she endured in private. As twilight deepened, Maria Theresa rose and moved with deliberate steps to the small, hidden alcove where the unmarked graves lay. Snow from the earlier storm still clung to the stone pathways, crunching softly beneath her feet. She knelt before the cold, unadorned markers, her hands resting lightly on the stones. One by one, she whispered the names she had imagined, the names she had never had the chance to give. She laid a single sprig of winter jasmine upon the largest stone, a delicate offering to lives the world had never known. She closed her eyes and imagined the children around her, invisible but present, their small spirits folded into the vast history of the Habsburg dynasty. In this quiet ritual, she found a fleeting solace, a way to reconcile the grandeur of empire with the intimacy of loss. Rising, she turned back toward the palace. Her steps were slow, measured, weighted by the years and the sorrow she had carried. She would return to her chambers, continue her duties, and meet the world with the composure it expected. But in that hidden alcove, beneath the shadow of monumental history, Maria Theresa left a piece of her heart, forever entwined with the children she never held. The Empress had ruled, had sacrificed, had endured. She had carried an empire upon her shoulders, and in silence she had buried her own heart. The candlelight flickered once, and the palace exhaled with the quiet acknowledgement of grief. Outside, the snow continued to fall. And the hidden little souls rested, at last,